We on? Let's go. Welcome to another episode of the OoruLabs podcast from Bengaluru. Ever complain how bad our cities are, how bad your commute is? You'll get to hear from people who are working to solve these problems in their own way. This is your soapbox for urban sustainability. I am Sathya Sankaran. I am joined today by Pawan Mulukutla, Director of Integrated Transport, Electric Mobility and Hydrogen, WRI India. He has been working at the intersection of urban mobility, energy and environment for more than 2 decades now. His organization has most recently helped the National E-Bus Procurement Program, and we'll talk about more today with Pawan. Welcome to the show, Pawan.
Hi, Satya. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to interact with you.
So let's start with this question. Is India ready for clean transportation? What do you think?
That's a $1 million question. Quite challenging, but let's look at some of the context, right? When you talk about what are the challenges we are facing in our cities, clearly, pollution, most of the polluted cities are in India, and specifically in urban areas, the transport related emissions, the dust, all that become a huge component, and it can vary anywhere between, some data we have seen 20 to 50% as high as that. And then in terms of the emissions itself, because of the vehicles being driven using fossil fuel, we are talking about almost close to 92% of the energy demand coming from the road transport itself for the transport sector, and 94% of the emissions from the transport are related to, again, road emissions. And then, of course, trucks almost contribute to 34%. And when you look at our oil demand that we are talking about, gasoline and diesel, the dominant energy sources, we are talking about 95% of sectors demand, and the road transport sector, in fact, is one of the largest oil consuming sector. So these are some points. And then when you look at the congestion itself, I think in Bangalore, we don't even need to talk about congestion. We'll dread to step out. We would really like to complete our, this interaction would have been in a panel or when we had met, but now we have discovered that this is the best way to do for all of us. So I think most of our cities are grappling with that, and that economic loss, almost close to USD 20 billion just from these big cities. So, we are facing fuel waste, productivity losses, and we haven't even talked about people, what toll it is taking on their health, the quality time that they could have been spending with families. So it has multiple dimensions when you're talking about should we be ready for energy transition. I'm not sure if energy transition is going to address all the issues that we are talking about, because congestion obviously cannot be addressed. It requires much more beyond the transition. But I see transition as an opportunity, not just as an energy transition, but also can we do a couple of other things around this energy transition? I think that then becomes a sweet spot for the Indian cities.
What are those other things that you are seeing as a potential in this green economy that involves also energy transition? Is what exactly in your definition is there any specific way you look at energy transition? Is it defined in a certain way that it needs to move to this fuel or that fuel?
I'm sure there are many definitions on Google, but let me put it the way I understand it. I think when we're talking about energy transitions, we are talking about to more sustainable choices, which helps in reducing the GHG emission, right? And helps us achieve our climate goals. I think let's look at it first from climate goals. Also, we talk about green development. I think development and climate goals, specifically for India, has to go together. So we have to actually talk about energy transition for India as a
Hmm.
different and alternative model, and not get stuck to just saying we will only address the climate issues. We have the issue of, we'll become the youngest nation by 2030, where people below 27 would be the average age. So the challenge is for us, how do you ensure that there are job creation? How do we ensure that vulnerable communities and their needs are taken care? So we need to really chart a different path. So I think India has this opportunity to redefine what energy transition means for
Hmm.
India.
And in terms of saying the opportunities lie in job creation and in also solving for the climate, right? What is the pathways you see amongst the industry that you're seeing right now? How are they looking at doing this transition? What are the challenges they're facing?
Yeah. See, a couple of things we clearly are aware is the EV transition that is happening right
Hmm.
now. And of course, the whole solar transition with the energy, the offshore winds, the solar, the renewable energy, basically, we're talking about. And how do we become very responsive and, not reactive. And with the EV transition specifically focusing onto the mobility sector, I think we have made a huge jump. We have almost close to 1 million electric three wheelers, 1 million electric two wheelers, maybe some thousands of cars. And I think bus programs, we have close to more than 4,500 electric buses already deployed on Indian roads, and almost another 20-30,000 electric buses in pipeline. We are also embarked on a pathway to bring electrification of the freight sector. And with all this, I think there's a big shift that is already happening. So we can't say we are in, we wouldn't have been able to talk anything in 2018-19, but now clearly we see a huge push. But I think still some of the challenges that were earlier there, they still remain, although their intensity may have come down, right? Like, for example, the purchase cost still
Mm.
remains an issue. And of course, state subsidies and national subsidies have helped really alleviate, reduce the burden on the end user. Then, of course, range anxiety and availability of charging infrastructure remains critical, because not everyone has the luxury of being able to have dedicated EV charging spots. So we lived in very dense cities. So how would we really have access to charging? Maybe for two wheeler it is easier. When it's e-rickshaws or e-autos, how do we ensure that people have access to enough charging? I think the cars are a little more easier, because people who will buy cars, obviously they would have thought of having a dedicated parking space. And then buses anyway happen in depots, and trucks are yet to be discovered. So I think range anxiety coupled with charging infrastructure, whether it is private or public charging infrastructure, remains a challenge. And I think we need a lot more products also, Satya. I think we don't talk enough about that. We are seeing many more coming probably in the cards. Some of the OEMs are still yet to make that foray into driving the EV conversation. And then let's look at the aftermarket. I think the aftermarket challenges also still remain. Do we have enough technicians? Do you really have enough network to really address any repair? For example, I was told recently that if you have a lithium ion e-rickshaw for any repair, the repair could go from anywhere between 7 days to 15 days, 20 days. And then if you pull out a vehicle for an auto or an e-rickshaw guy, for so long, it's going to impact their livelihood. So we need to really be cognizant of multiple dimensions, and we can't say that that okay, we are solving for one segment or one form factor, it will solve for other form factor. Actually, it's very unique. That's why I keep saying that our energy transition or our EV transition is so different, because we are not just doing cars for the transition, right? We have a two-wheeler segment, we have a three-wheeler segment, we have cars, we have buses, we have trucks. So we are dealing with this five monsters, if I may say so, simultaneously. Unlike in West, where they're just doing with cars, maybe, and trucks. So that's the issue we have, and each segment by itself is so different, where uh, many are cost sensitive, many are technologically need to be savvy, and we need to discover different business models also.
In all of these challenges, what do you think are the top two for the immediate term that the industry is trying to solve? I'll come back to the messy middle and we talk about all the other fuels, but in the EV space, what are the most popular traction items right now that the industry is trying to solve? And even the challenges, are they trying to solve for range first, or are they trying to solve for service and aftermarket first? How are they trying to look at this?
I think I would say two challenges, or top two you asked. So top two challenges for me would be better products, if you look from OEM perspective, because that will then also build in customer satisfaction. Because better product means what you exactly said, better range, and more efficiency, and it should be um, comparable both in technical performance as well as your economic cost performance with your ICE vehicles. If you don't have that, then it becomes very difficult. So I think that's what the industry is trying to solve. And the other issue is this whole charging infrastructure, because I think there needs to be enough charging infrastructure, both public and private. And the process, it's not just more about the getting the enough infrastructure, it's also that our processes in our cities are very cumbersome because multiple departments are involved, and we don't have a governance structure saying that okay, this you can go to utility, but then you will need to get the municipal corporation or the urban development department. Multiple players are there to get a installation. Maybe one city have solved this issue, Satya, but I think many other cities don't have any mechanism on how they will create a dense distributed network of charging. So I think these two issues become dominant, and a little long term that I can already see is the grid capacity and the
Mm,
issues that we'll start
mm.
seeing once we have large number of adoption of electric vehicles.
I'll come back to the grid because we'll tackle that with the government piece of it. But in the EV space itself, if you see, there's a lot of two-wheeler and three-wheelers, auto rickshaws and scooters picking up pace faster than the cars have. Those are more amenable to battery swapping. What have you heard about? What is the trends there? And is that picking up without any ideological bias, or this is what it should be, or this is what it should be? There will be a mix of both at some point in time. Would that be would the difficulties in putting charging infrastructure drive more people to swap their batteries?
Yeah, at the national level, there was a battery swapping policy that was being driven. I don't think we have made much progress there. I mean, there have been a lot of consultations, and there was this initiative to bring in battery swapping policy. But let's leave the policy aside. I think as an industry, there have been a lot of pilots and testings going on. See, one of the challenges, battery swapping is, in my opinion, personally works well for two-wheelers and three-wheeler segments, because this then makes it a little asset light model where you're saying I'll buy the vehicle separately and battery price is just I'm renting it. So you can introduce a new business battery as a service model, BaaS, and other stuff. I think the issue, a couple of challenges that I see, three, four there, is one, you will need some small dedicated space in parking zones where this swapping stations can be installed, right? You at least need to have 12 batteries, and then they will need to have that electricity connection, power connection to be able to charge. The way we could do is maybe put it in some RWAs. Is there a way for RWAs and, some shops and all that to come in? I think in the Indian conditions, the challenge we may face is what is the quality of batteries that are coming into this. And we don't want all kinds of batteries into, right? Like the cells, which are, they say there's type A, type B, type C cell. We don't want to start having fire explosions in public domain and kill the whole model itself. So how do we ensure those quality and not allow the permit system there? Like, who is going to put this? How would you have a mechanism that you are able to allow people with genuine business models and good batteries to really put out? That's one. The other part itself is that it is going to be a little expensive for the battery company itself, because now for it's not a 1:1 ratio, right, Satya? You will need at least maybe more 30%, 40% inventory, or 20%, whatever that percentage is. So that then becomes like, who are the players who can take that on and allow that market and ecosystem to develop? So I think that's the challenge here, because you really need literally, like, every street should have, if you're talking about 1 kilometer of street, with the number of vehicles that we have, we are talking about at least having 15, 20 swap stations along the stretch of the street, given the intensity of the vehicles that we have. So space constraint, the connectivity to the power supply, and then third, the inventory management from a battery company becomes important, because then your business model will click, and we need to see how this will work.
So there are certain nationally defined contributions that we have committed to going net zero by 2070 and things like that. Now, electric vehicle has become the fastest pickup right now in terms of an alternate to the fossil fuels. What are the other things you're saying? Has there been talk of other types of fuel that has come into the market that people are looking at?
Specifically, if you see from an overall 2070 net zero just for the transport sector, then I think we're talking big time on the battery electric vehicles,
Mhm.
especially in Indian context. Um, the National Green Hydrogen Mission that was announced focuses pilot projects for transport sector somewhere in 2026-27 on hydrogen buses and hydrogen trucks.
Mm.
So in the long haul, probably we'll see proliferation with trucks and buses becoming hydrogen, which becomes an option, but not in the next 5 to 10 years. I would say probably if you are talking about a scale, then we are talking about clearly 2030, 2035 for hydrogen trucks and buses specifically in India. So the option we are left out right now is dominant option, I would say, is lithium ion based battery electric, and maybe there are different chemistries that can come with lithium itself. But the other choices that we have, which are being explored, are also biofuels. And India
Mm.
announced a biofuel. We kickstarted a biofuel platform also, which was announced. And
Mhm.
there we need to see how this ethanol and other blends can really, bio CNG and other stuff can really, syngas can really help in actually addressing some of the mobility requirements itself. But on the industry side, I think hydrogen has much more bigger role to play because you're talking about use of hydrogen in steel, in refinery, in fertilizers, in ports. So there is much more, and city gas distribution. So there you see there's much more application. But for mobility, I think it will be dominantly the battery electric.
So the industrialization space is more amenable for using hydrogen because of the heavy nature of energy involved in consumption. But what do you think about the long haul trucks and buses and other things? Because the range will definitely be an issue, and you can't have many hours of charging for a large vehicle along the highway. The downtime is the biggest thing in charging, right? I mean, even if you do fast charges, you can't keep doing it all the time. You bring the battery life down, and the cost adds up. What do you see as the ability for large vehicles to adopt hydrogen, and where is so there are different types of hydrogen, like, right? There's green, there's blue, gray. I mean, all colors and shades are there. So, are we looking at green right up front, or are we looking at other sources of hydrogen also?
See, currently, gray is already used.
Hmm.
So with all your
Electrolysis.
refineries, steel and cement and all kinds of industries today also use gray, and we consume about 10% of the global output today,
Hmm.
roughly. But what India's mission says very clearly is green hydrogen, renewable energy driven, and we will do green. We are not going to do blue and get into capture CCUS, carbon capture methodologies. But let's use renewable energy and biomass as the green hydrogen option, which is basically electrolysis driven with your electricity coming from renewable energies. Now, having said that, Satya, I think the long haul, specifically going back to your question, I would say that yes, there will be challenges with battery electric in the long haul. If you're talking about distances of 350, 400, 500, and much more. But what we have observed is dominantly the distances in India are also within 200 to 300 range for the long haul or medium haul, let me say. I think long haul will not be able to address very clearly with battery electric right now. We will need to use fuel cell based technologies, given that they'll give longer range and more reliability. But I think, given the safety concerns and all that with hydrogen and fuel cell, I think we'll need to wait and develop, because right now the way hydrogen is being envisaged is co-location. Let's
Hmm.
do it in area where you produce hydrogen and you consume there itself, and the mobility, because you have to store it at 700 bar pressure, so there's much more issues where it will become energy intensive, in fact. So we'll have to really think that is, are we ready for storage and distribution? Some say we'll convert it into ammonia and then transport, because it's easy to transport ammonia and then convert it back to hydrogen. So there are all these efficiency issues will kick in, then you'll have energy losses and all that, and we'll have to see how much are we able to achieve. I think for now, the best thing for long haul would be, of course, there is a thinking that it should be rail driven, and the last
Hmm.
mile could be actually road based transport. So we really need to use that combination and not just limit to saying that everything should be here. just battery electric.
The heavy thing brings me to the question of the e-bus program that was recently launched. You guys played that WRI a huge part in trying to help define that. The earlier version of the e-bus program was the driven by EESL, I think, right? So it was the what was it called again? I forget.
The
The-
Grand Challenge and then the National Electric Bus Program, NEBP.
Exactly. Is this a extension of that? Is it being conceptualized differently? What is the nature of this new bus program and the e-bus program? Let's make the E in that very clear.
So I think a couple of things happened, right? So there was FAME 1, which was based upon outright purchase model. Basically, all cities had to buy those buses. And then I think all the state transport undertakings, the STUs, had a struggle because there was this need for understanding the technology, the charging, the what's the right battery size, which routes to develop. So it was too much of, for them to really catch up with understanding the technology and to be able to do this. And then the adoption was also slow. All were hesitant with high upfront costs. Of course, there was subsidy of 45 lakhs and 55 lakhs from FAME. Now come FAME 2, they said, let's do all to be what we call as gross cost contract, GCC model, which is more like a lease model, where you will do long contracts and all that. And then some cities adopted, but still the adoption was slow. So then they came up with this grand challenge where CESL was the implementing or not implementing, literally, getting the project man, PME.
Hmm.
And WRI India was supporting CESL. So what they did is we limited it to just the top 9 cities in terms of populations. And then they said, let's bring these cities together and define common specs and aggregate the demand. So I think that was a very unique thing that was done in Grand Challenge. And we are seeing now those buses getting deployed. So almost 4,200 plus buses were awarded for 5 cities. So what it did was it really created for the first time a common specs around electric buses and aggregated the demand. So this gave a clear signal to OEMs, and thus the prices slashed by almost between 25 to 30%. That was the effect when compared to your diesel buses. Post the Grand Challenge, then there was this whole announcement of National Electric Bus Program, NEBP, which said we will go ahead with 50,000 buses. And then they again created this whole demand aggregation from cities that were interested, and we still saw a price point drop by 24%. And then they tried another dry lease model that didn't really work out. We were a little worried that a lot of financing mechanisms like payment securities had to be done, viability gap funding had to come. So this was all happening between Ministry of Heavy Industries, CESL, and all of us were supporting. In between, in the 2021 budget, the government announced a 20,000 crore program or 18,000 crore program for 20,000 buses. And then the model was being developed. Initially, to begin with, it was envisioned as all kinds of buses. But when they saw the learning that electric buses price points were lower and then cities were becoming comfortable, it was converted into a all electric bus scheme, almost close to 10,000 buses for more than 100 cities, which are actually not the 9 mega cities, but the other 1 million plus cities which were eligible to go and get these buses deployed. The scheme is called PM E-Bus Seva scheme, which was launched on August 16th on the occasion of the Independence Day. What is very interesting, Satya, and I think this is how we need to think, is it gives viability gap funding on a per kilometer basis. So you're saying that I will actually cover the difference between your earning and your cost. And the scheme will actually say that we are putting some money on the table, and then states will also have to do. So you create a big per kilometer basis model, which is already actually existing in some of the states, specifically in Gujarat, where they've used this CM model which was launched, which is basically covering the viability gap. And I think it is really nice because that burden then doesn't fall on all these STUs. So that's happening, and it's now been announced they are really being aggressive in getting this deployed on road in the next couple of months and years. And this will be good because many more cities will come. But I think the opportunity and challenges both together, one will be how do you build a robust intelligent transport system which actually helps us to track the performance of batteries, the vehicles, based upon certain standards, because we're deploying all this and we don't want to be without any data and be then struggling. So we need to ensure that that is integrated based on certain standards and protocols that we follow on how to capture this data. And this data will then unlock finances, Satya. The biggest thing is if you're able to share how your batteries are performing, finances will be able to come in and say that we want to fund more of this. I think it has that potential. It will really help you understand your whole city level performance of how do you do your operations, which the data is missing, right? So we need to ensure the devices we are putting are not of low quality, whether it is your GPS, your ticketing, all this kind of machines that we have are very standardized, and we are able to capture those data. And cities are equipped to able to understand what is this happening. And of course, your battery and your charging. That's one part on the ITS. The other part is the financing part. So you must have read about this US India 125 million payment security mechanism for 10,000 electric buses when Mr. Biden, President Biden and PM Modi met, and
Mm.
this was agreed between US India. So now I think India is creating, from what I've heard, I may not be correct, but a payment security mechanism pool of 3,000 crores on a revolving basis. So this will actually ensure that your contracts are watertight
Mm.
and you're able to do um, your financing in a better way. So you're developing VGF, you are getting payment security to ensure that the risk of operators comes down. So all these things become really helpful, and we are able to do this in a more better way.
Just coming back to the financial part of this, the previous model did not talk about VGF. It actually did a fare fixation at some 42 rupees or something, right? My conversation with Ravi, if I remember. You guys used the economies of collective bargaining and got it down at that. Even though it is a GCC model, there was a price fixed. But now you're saying each city can discover the price, but whatever that price is that is discovered, the VGF will be given, is what you're saying. How is it different from the old one?
So here um, the subsidy was still being given to OEMs, right? In the
The
previous model,
previous one. Oh, okay. Hmm.
it was still subsidy on a GCC model. So when they did with subsidy and without subsidy, both the models have been there. So basically, there you said, okay, this is the demand. What is the price per kilometer?
Correct.
With subsidy, they said, okay, this subsidy is coming on a per kilometer basis, and there will be a time period for OEMs plus operator consortium to get it paid. So that is how the model was. But now this model is very different. It's not a subsidy model, right? It is a viability gap funding model that it's fixed. That this is the VGF the government will. I think I don't know if it is 21 rupees or 24 rupees per kilometer. So that is the subsidy that the national government will give, and states will top up on above it. So if you're saying that my cost of operating an electric bus with my driver, conductor, electricity, everything is coming to say 75 rupees. I'm just giving some ballpark number, 70 rupees assume. So you'll get say 24 rupees or something from the national government scheme, the PM e-bus Seva scheme. So it will become close to 56 or sorry 46, and then the states will give say another 12 rupees, or whatever they are giving. I think there is some number, or they give another 24, so then it comes down. Now what will that help is that your earnings typically are between 30 and 35 rupees per kilometer. So people need to understand that buses only earn 30 rupees, 35 rupees, but their cost could be anywhere between 70 to 80. And if you include the infrastructure cost also, that it will go up a little bit, because all these depots have to be e-bus ready and all that, right? So I feel this scheme is much more better, because you are giving a solid, say, anywhere between 35 to 45 rupees per kilometer. We can argue on the number later, but it's really helping STUs not to be worried about where they will get the additional money from. So
Hmm.
that way they will then have a foolproof focus on operations and planning, and eventually they'll move to planning. So I feel this model is much more better. And with the national payment security mechanism model that is coming in, I think it becomes even more helpful. So that way you say, okay, for some reason the state is not able to pay per kilometer, they at least have this pool where they can dip and get access to funding. So even more, I think in future we should be even talking about insurances. Private
Hmm.
insurances can also come into, right, really, pay to operators, right, based upon. And one more thing that will happen because of this new model with payment security is it will help STUs build their credit rating going forward. because they are actually going to be now paying on a timely basis. And if they're not using that payment security mechanism, then it will really keep adding to their credit ratings, credit history.
This still assumes that you will be running on a GCC model, right? It doesn't say that you need to procure the buses.
It's a
Fair
GCC.
enough. Just want to come back to the grid part of the things, right? So the generation part of the fuel, electricity, predominantly, we're still the transport sector. You said consumes a lot of the energy needs, and the intensity is going to come from that, as well as from the industry and the manufacturing and all of those things. But the amount of electric vehicles that are going to be put out with a lot of charging requirements and everything is definitely going to increase. Not as much as the rest, but because the transition is happening more visibly in this space. How are we doing on green energy? Any idea on the back end, on the production side of things? Because as far as I can remember, even 3 4 years ago, we were still rolling out coal-fired power plants and things like that. How are we doing on the generation of green energy and solar and wind and whatever else is there?
See, I think there are enough numbers available, but we are on track, right? We are committed to 500 gigawatt of installed capacity of renewable energy by 2030.
Mm.
And I think the hydrogen and then the need for electric to be based on clean energy will also stir more demand for this renewable energy base. But I think what will work eventually for us is also the individual rooftop solars, and all that actually will play a big role, because if I'm able to put it back to the grid, or as individual homeowners, we are able to charge our vehicles using renewable energy. I think that becomes a big benefit. Depot places are one more location where you can see they are already installing solar panels, because they are big surfaces, and it's possible that you can use that energy for opportunity charging during daytime. Right? See, there are some numbers that even if we have somewhere about one third of our sales to be EVs by 2030, we're talking about a huge demands, maybe 35 tera watt. It's not even giga, right? We're even going beyond that. So we'll need to really start thinking of how do we create this whole battery storage models. And
Mm.
that the renewable energy will then really help us think through that, can we use the energy storage in other applications, where the energy need not be used, can be stored, um, and can be used. So I think that model becomes like industrial clusters, your DGs, your backup for residentials and all that can then move to battery storage, and the energy generation generated with your distributed solar and your renewable energies can supply the mobility. So I think that option we need to start exploring how this will really work and then support. So that's going to be very, very clear. And I think utility companies are thinking, right, how they are going to see this additional demand come up. So I think first step for me, Satya, would be that where energy companies are actually taking into consideration these projections. Today, I
Mm.
think the challenge is probably two or three utility companies are thinking that, okay, EV is going to come, and in our scenario, what kind of additional energy requirement will be needed, and how do we then create this whole network? Because, right, your transformers need to be their capacity also needs to be graded, and the distribution losses have to be minimized. So I think we have a big work. I would say the grid is definitely a challenge, more so in the urban areas, because in rural you can actually create mini grids, and you can meet the requirements for charging of EVs. But in urban areas, I think it's going to be a big challenge, and we need to start thinking how utility companies are thinking of this additional energy requirement, and how would they really then source it from renewable sources.
And it's become that much more urgent to kind of look at power sector deregulation and reforms as well. I don't think putting all our eggs in the public sector grid basket is going to help. And there are lots of people today with the ability to have independent storage, not just personally, but being able to share it with in your neighborhood, inside the tech park with other people and the neighboring tech parks and things like that. At some point we will approach that, because the ability to not rely on only the grid power and the I can understand when there were coal plants and hydroelectricity which are heavily relying on natural resources, having that control, but it's about time that we started looking at the common public good, like sun available to us and the wind available to us. We can generate some and share with others. There might be some kind of course, it's beyond the transportation question, but I think it is. Don't you think it's time to have those discussions as well?
This is being MNRE is driving this conversation. The Ministry of New
Hmm.
and Renewable Energy, big time. They have a huge focus on solar and offshore wind, and all those additional sources that they are really exploring. So that said, I think a lot of onus is also actually on the states. How prepared they are looking at and how they are working with utility companies to really make this grow and happen. Actually,
And when you do that, that's the challenge with the states. While it is good, we need to leave it to the states. You have to decentralize this decision making. But there's a lot of close-endedness in some of the states, and until they realize that we can allow some more people to come in and play and get this energy out, it's going to be a challenge. But nevertheless, I think the transport sector will benefit from availability and capture and distribution of more power beyond just the discoms alone. But tell me about some of the policies. You guys have been looking at some of this policy space. While the industry has a lot of work to do and there's a huge scope in providing the products, you mentioned that very clearly. We are so way down that the amount of products that is required to be done is so much more. How are the innovators scaling up, and how is the ease of business for new innovators? You've been running a lot of challenges like stamp and other things. What have you seen on the EV space coming up from there? And has the government support been enough? Have they stayed, or have they stayed out of the way enough? Have they been able to give enough motivation to people?
the government support has been there, but for a country like India, it's never going to be enough, right? For the sheer size of population, I think there's much more that needs to be done. So, no, I think there have been more than 600 startups, Satya, in the last 5 6 years, which have looked at in the EV sector, and there's a lot more now interest to really ensure that all this energy transition is I think we are moving away from service models, right? I think the dominant more focus during the earlier innovation was just services, but here you're talking about manufacturing, you're talking about battery technologies. Recently I met 2 3 startups. One was doing a zinc based battery for e-rickshaws. So there is lot more thinking that is going on, that we really need to just get beyond the services. So I think that's one good part. And I think if you take one of the big manufacturing company out, I think we have seen close to almost $1 billion investment in startups in the EV sector in the last 5 6 years. So I think that's a big push coming, but of course a lot more needs to happen. And then there is Invest India program. There are multiple accelerator. The Department of Science and Technology supports many initiatives as well. In terms of the government schemes itself, I'm just not talking about policies, because there are most of the states have EV policies. There is FIM, and then they have a lot of incentives also that they have talked about. Specifically, I wanted to focus on PLI scheme, right, where the automobile and auto component industries, for the first time we said, there's been almost an allocation of 26,000 crores. This basically talks about financial incentives to put domestic manufacturing in advanced automotive technologies, and also how do we create economies of scale and building a robust supply chain. I think for us, focusing on the manufacturing and building a robust supply chain will really become extremely important. And then there was another PLI scheme, which is for the advanced chemistry cell for battery storage also. They were looking not just at lithium, but looking at multiple other chemistry of 50 gigawatt of ACC, and then there's been an outlay of 18,000 crores. There were now stocks also bringing. We also had waste management rules that was adopted in 2022. So I think a lot is happening. Satya, finally, I see comfortable that we're doing a lot of focus on the manufacturing finally, but I still feel we need to do a lot more in a more strategic way. See, India has 4 5 auto clusters, right? One you have in northern part in the NCR Gurgaon belt. Then you have near the Nashik, Aurangabad, that belt you have the Chennai area has typically been, the Detroit of India, what we call. Then you actually have Coimbatore, and then Bangalore has the R&D and the Hosur interaction, right? So there are these typical existing auto clusters, and some new actually electric auto clusters are coming where Telangana has focused in Usmanabad, and they're trying to attract investment for bus manufacturing and for truck manufacturing. Gujarat also has done. So we need to also ensure that how do we strengthen our manufacturing basis and not spread too much. Maybe we actually have to think through a little bit on that context. So that's, I think, one of the big stuff for us to really think through about strengthening the manufacturing. Because I think demand wise, you can create policies, awareness campaigns, and that will drive. But I think more thrust has to keep coming around manufacturing, establishing a supply chain. And we are now not immune to global challenges in the supply chain, right? We clearly saw what happened to the semiconductors, and then they said that the wait time for car deliveries are going to be more than a year too, and the requirement for batteries and all this electronics for the chip design was going to be extremely critical. So I think we need to even enhance those. I'm not saying that every part of the supply chain has to be in India, but we need to be enough in the upstream to be able to ensure we are catering to our market and we have a say in the global automobile manufacturing. Otherwise, it could pose a big challenge for us in the electric mobility sector.
I think so. You rightly pointed out. If you look at the upstream manufacturing, also, let's say you're making a battery management system board, not a single component on that board, other than the fact that I designed the circuit, not a single component from the MOSFET to the shunt to the ESP32. None of those are from India. There are comparative advantages. I can't make a MOSFET here at the cost at which they could make it in China and ship it to me. So there are challenges in the manufacturing, and it's a long road ahead. When we talk about semiconductor and chip, everybody's thinking some big, massive computer or a silicon wafer or some such thing. Of course, you need the wafer to get even a simple switch or a MOSFET or a diode to come out of here. Anyway, nevertheless, but there are challenges on the production side, I think, which might hamper us, and also the rare earth dependencies of lithium and other things, right?
Critical minerals, right? Access to critical minerals. How are we part of the global networks? So I think, and we know that where these concentrations are, and those partnerships and those collaborations with the different countries. It's not even at industry level, right? Of course, industry cooperation, but even bilaterally, trilaterally, whatever. I think those have actually become very critical. And now I think there's more awareness. The government of India actually has its own company which engages in these partnerships for getting access to these critical minerals. And I think India is becoming part of some of these global supply chain platforms, which is a good thing to do.
Let's just drive down to the city level now, which is basically most of these are apparent in cities. The traffic is higher, there is a lot more uh, because of the concentration of both energy and mobility in large cities like ours. Range anxiety is that less of an issue, and of course that leads to my favorite swapping versus charging conversations. But nevertheless, what are city governments doing in this space? Because half of them aren't. It is driven at a national level nicely. The states are getting involved with a few policies that are interesting for them as well. But do you see any city governments finding out how to they decarbonize faster? What examples do you see? I think Delhi is doing quite well because of all the pollution challenges they have had to, a gun to their head, and they are doing a bunch of things. UP apparently is also picking up. What have you seen?
Yeah, in fact, something very interesting, right? Delhi, of course, by its very nature, state city has been able to do a lot. And of course, they also don't need to worry about the supply side. They have to just worry about the demand side, right? Because they don't need to manufacture vehicles. So it becomes a little lot easier, not that it is, but still it's better. But I've seen many of the states, right? For example, UP is doing something very interesting. They're developing this comprehensive electric mobility plan for all the cities. I think 12 cities or 14 cities. So
Hmm.
that then really helps them to think at a city level, what do we really need to do in each of these cities, whether it's related to e-buses or charging infrastructure, your business models, and of course then at an aggregated level, the financing you will need. Even Bihar, I think some of the cities, actually 3 cities, 4 cities, have embarked on that strategy that please tell us what should we do to transition. I think that's a very, very good approach, Satya. That is the only way states will be able to translate. I know Tamil Nadu policy focused on 6 cities, which said that 6 cities will have their electric buses to be electric 50% or 25%. So I think if you look at many of the state policies, the way they have been addressed, they do at some extent get down to city level, because they also realize that's the way to also address transition. But if we want to strengthen the city model, I think two, three things need to happen. One is the governance and institutional structure. Can we have EV cell at a city level that is really
Hmm.
looking at the needs and then feeding it into the state? Because unless we strengthen that, I don't think we'll be able to get that. And then, of course, setting targets, driving ambitions, developing plans, and then securing financing would then really help to steer this conversation. So I think that's the way to start thinking. Many are doing it. I don't think we hear enough about it, but I think many states have already started looking on how do we really get into this whole city
Last but not the least, the disincentives for fossil fuel.
level.
There are lots of things that you and I have done quite a lot of thinking about. I mean, there are this congestion charging kind of thing. There is this whole price of petrol and diesel, which the subsidies are being removed. Any thoughts around that? What's
No,
going
I
on?
think that's a good thing, right? It impacts many of us, but I think while we are doing disincentives, let's strengthen the existing systems also, because the whole model doesn't work if you apply disincentives but you don't have alternative choices for people available. But having said that, I think removing subsidies was important for whatever reason. And couple of other things that we can do, we can explore this whole low emission zone models, right? Like create
Hmm.
LEZs in cities which only allow for certain, I'm not just saying only EVs, but certain emission standards or practices can be applied for creating. And you then emphasize walking, cycling, and public transport as a big component of LEZs. I don't think we can move away from that basic of walking, cycling, and public transport in whatever transition we do. Probably we should have spoken about this at the very beginning, Satya. But I think that remains the core of how cities should be looking at things. In addition, while we are doing all these LECs, and within LECs, I think there is LECs has multiple dimensions, right? You can look at congestion price, you can look at parking charges. There
Hmm.
are different ways for us to even think of, what is it that as a city, what is our goal to achieve that. So once the city starts setting their agenda, I think there's many more tools that are available to drive it. But the challenge is, okay, this is my ambition. And the problem the city faces is it politically viable solutions. And that's where they really need to work. So if you create the alternatives and you strengthen that, if you have a city which has excellent public transport system, Satya, then if you introduce the changes, it becomes easier, right? Congestion. I mean, London now, last 1 2 weeks back, they said they have done the whole city of London as an LEC, and there are charges for people to drive into it. Of course, there's some backlash and all that, but they were able to do because they've actually been doing incrementally many things. They started at score, they reduce speeds, they develop infra for walking, they really develop infra for cycling. If you don't do this part and you simply say I need to do disincentives, I don't think it's going to be politically a viable solution.
And I agree with you. I think you have to back it up. And I think there are already places around like the TOD policy. Also, you guys have worked on SWRI in some places, right? TOD is a zone where there is already an alternative available and low emission zones could be looked at. And I think it has been proposed already. And you are right. My favorite topic should have been touched first, but I kept the best for the last. I think there is no getting away from the fact that while we have a lot of electric and other fuel options, the lower fuel you consume in general would always be better, and nothing better than cycling, walking, and public transport. It is a long haul. I think the maturity is coming. We are getting better buses, but then the coverage is a planning exercise that needs to be done and the bullet needs to be bit. There is never a perfect political solution. You also know that. I mean, there will always be a loss aversion bias among people. So why don't we get to that part as the last piece is how are the people looking at this? I know there's a lot of excitement around EV. There's a lot of excitement around e-buses and all of those things. At the end of the day, the behavior is not dependent on the fuel. It is dependent on our network and on the plan. You just mentioned that. How do you think we can leverage this transition to actually reduce the emissions? It need not only be EVs and hydrogen. It could be what you said is there a mix of all these things? There is no 100% of this or that. It's a mode share mix each city needs to discover based on its characteristics. Like Bengaluru has more narrower streets, so it can, and a better weather, so it can discover a different pattern of mode shift, which is different from Delhi's wide roads and whatever. So, is there something that you think we can look at for the future beyond the
We
fuel?
should look for present and future. I think the most important thing for us is, as cities are looking at this whole EV transition, I don't think they should look at it in isolation. The EV plans actually should be developed in conjunction with what we are doing to address walking and cycling. I think the public transport part with e-buses is getting addressed. My worry is that the walking and cycling part is not getting addressed. And is there a way for cities to be bold to say, if what if Bangalore announces and allocates funds and creates mechanism to say we'll do 4,000, 5,000 kilometers of walking based on certain standard, right? Like certain standard way of how a footpath should be and where crossing should be, and that's our mission for next 3 to 5 years. The brand Bangalore should really look at how do you connect to your water bodies, to your lakes, to your metro stations, to your schools. If we can drive and make this a massive, just not campaign plus infra, I always will say, not just campaign plus infra, I think we can solve at least 30-40% of our problem just by simply doing this. We'll have kids walking to schools, people accessing public transport. I think the walking infrastructure as you move into suburbs and periphery becomes extremely challenging, and so that's a big opportunity. And I really would look for a bold and an ambitious announcement, and all of us really should push for that as we really engage with local governments.
I think low emission city, you just gave a good idea for the government now to think about. Well, low emission city could be the brand. That's great. On that note, Pawan, thanks a lot for coming on the show and unpacking all these things for us. It's been an enlightening conversation for me, and I hope the viewers liked it as well. So, request them to like, subscribe, and share this video so we can bring more interesting guests like Pawan on the show and have him back again talking about many of the other things he and I share with walking and cycling maybe one day, even though he's doing a lot of the low energy stuff. Thank you very much, everyone. And thanks, Pawan. And see you all next week. Bye bye.
Thank you, Satya. Thank you all. Bye.